She'd always kept the jewelry in the top drawer of her dresser, not because it was the safest place in the world, but because it felt close. Tangible. A soft clink whenever she opened the drawer to grab a pair of socks or a sweater, the small velvet boxes tucked neatly beside folded scarves. Each piece had its own story, some older than she could remember, some carrying the smell of her mother's perfume even now, years after she'd passed. That afternoon, she came home tired but content. She'd spent the day with her own mother, or rather, her mother's sister, the closest thing she had left of the woman who'd once worn those bangles and that wedding necklace with a kind of quiet pride. They'd talked about everything and nothing, sharing tea and memories of home and the people who had gone before. She'd left her aunt's house feeling a little lighter, reminded that no matter how frayed her life felt these days, she still had roots, still had pieces of herself that no one could take away. Or so she thought. She dropped her bag by the door, kicked off her shoes, and walked to the bedroom to change out of her work clothes. She hummed as she opened the dresser drawer, thinking about the tiny silver earrings she planned to wear to her cousin's wedding the next weekend. They were simple, just small hoops her grandmother had given her the day she turned 16. Her first grown woman gift, her grandmother had teased. But when she pulled open the drawer, her hand met empty velvet. The boxes were gone. She pushed aside the scarves, the old birthday cards she kept hidden away. Nothing. She opened the other drawers, checked behind the shoes in the closet, even the tiny safe under the bed she'd meant to install properly years ago but never had. Gone. Every last piece. Her chest went tight, her thoughts racing in wild circles. Maybe she'd moved them and forgotten. Maybe her husband had tucked them away for safekeeping. But even as she thought it, she knew it wasn't true. She'd always been the careful one. The one who counted every piece after a family event, who cleaned each clasp and hinge, who traced her fingers over the old engraving on her mother's ring as if touching it could bring her back for a moment. She found her husband in the living room, lounging on the couch with his phone propped up in his palm. He barely looked up when she asked if he'd seen the jewelry box. She watched a flicker cross his face, a guilt, or maybe just that shallow discomfort he got when she asked a question he didn't want to answer. "Oh, right," he said, voice too casual. "Mom wanted to hold on to it for a bit. You know, make sure it stays safe. She was worried about, the neighborhood. Break-ins and all." She felt her mouth go dry. "You gave her my family's jewelry?" He shrugged. "I didn't think you'd mind. She said she'd keep it in her safe. You know she has that big one in her basement. It's not like she took it for good." The word settled over her like a snowfall that burns instead of cools. She knew that safe, she'd seen it once, a giant old metal box hidden behind her mother-in-law's shelves of old cookbooks and boxes of moth-eaten blankets. She also knew her mother-in-law. Knew the way the older woman looked at her family's heirlooms like they were trinkets to be handed out at her convenience. Knew how she'd made snide comments at the wedding about all that old gold and how these things should stay in the proper family hands. She felt her knees go soft. She sat down on the edge of the bed, staring at the empty drawer. So much gone in a single, careless choice. And not a single word to her about it. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a quiet, cold resolve began to form. If they thought they could treat her history like it was worthless, they were about to learn just how much worth she knew it carried. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed next to her husband, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet drone of the city outside their window. He'd fallen asleep easily, as if the theft of decades of family history was nothing more than an awkward misunderstanding that would sort itself out in the morning. She wondered if he'd always been like this, so casual with things that weren't his to give away. Or if it was something he'd learned from his mother, who never seemed to see the line between mine and yours as anything more than a suggestion she could step over when it suited her. By dawn, she knew what she had to do. She got up, dressed in the same clothes she'd tossed on the floor the night before, and tied her hair back. She looked at herself in the mirror, the shadows under her eyes, the set of her jaw. She looked tired, but something else too. Sharper. She called her mother-in-law's house that morning. The older woman picked up after a few rings, her voice sickly sweet. "Oh, hello dear. Everything all right?" Like nothing had happened. Like they were just chatting about the weather. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "I'm coming over. We need to talk." The pause on the other end told her everything she needed to know. When she arrived, her mother-in-law opened the door with a smile that didn't touch her eyes. The house smelled like cheap floral air freshener and stale cookies. The older woman ushered her in, chirping about how nice it was to see her, asking if she wanted tea. She declined. She wasn't here to play pretend. They sat across from each other at the dining table, a lace tablecloth draped over wood so old it was splintering at the edges. Her mother-in-law folded her hands in her lap, looking every bit the innocent matriarch. "I want my jewelry back," she said, voice steady. She laid her palms flat on the table so they wouldn't tremble. "All of it." The older woman's smile flickered. "Oh, sweetheart, I don't have it anymore." She felt her stomach drop. "What do you mean you don't have it?" Her mother-in-law sighed, as if this were a tedious misunderstanding. "You hardly ever wore those old things. They're just gathering dust, and you know, it's better if someone who appreciates them has them. So I gave them to Melissa." Melissa. Her sister-in-law. She felt a hot flash of disbelief. "You gave my mother's wedding jewelry to Melissa?" "Don't be so dramatic," her mother-in-law snapped, her syrupy tone slipping. "You married into this family. Those things belong with the family now. Melissa has 2 daughters, they'll cherish them. It makes more sense than letting them sit in your tiny dresser forever. Besides, you never really fit the style, did you?" Every word struck like an open palm across her face. Her mother's necklace. The bangles her grandmother had worn through every festival, every family celebration. The earrings she'd promised she'd pass on one day, if she had a daughter of her own. The old woman had torn those memories from her without so much as a phone call. "You had no right," she said, her voice low, trembling at the edges but not breaking. The older woman rolled her eyes. "Don't be so sensitive. You should be grateful I kept them in the family. Your people should be honored." The way she said your people made her feel like she was 10 years old again, standing on the outside of her husband's family gatherings, smiling politely through jokes that always turned back on her. "And what about my husband?" she asked, though she already knew. Did he know? Her mother-in-law's smile returned, cruel at the corners. "Oh, he understands. He's not going to start a fight over a few bits of old gold. He knows who keeps this family together. You should too." She stood up then. She didn't want the stale cookies or the cold tea or the condescending voice reminding her that she would always be the outsider if she didn't learn to play by their rules. But she'd learned something else too. They only understood power when it wore a polite smile and carried a knife behind its back. If they thought they could treat her inheritance like a trinket to pass around, they were about to find out she was more than the girl who smiled and swallowed her anger. She'd call the jeweler. And then she'd call her lawyer. She sat alone at the kitchen table that night, the house so still she could hear the pipes creak behind the walls. The mug of tea she'd made for herself had gone cold, untouched. The light above her buzzed faintly, but she didn't flick it off. Instead, she spread out what little she had left: photos, old receipts, tiny scraps of history that made up a story her mother-in-law would never understand. She picked up an old Polaroid first, her mother on her wedding day, hair braided tight under the weight of a gold necklace so heavy it looked like it might topple her forward. But her mother stood straight, shoulders back, eyes shining with a kind of defiance she wished she could bottle. Her father stood beside her, proud in a plain suit, his fingers curled protectively around her mother's wrist. That necklace wasn't just decoration, it was a promise. It was years of careful savings, hidden coins, small sacrifices stitched together to make sure their daughter wouldn't enter her new life empty-handed. She touched her own throat absently, remembering how it felt when her mother placed that necklace in her palm the night before her own wedding. She'd been young, too young, maybe, sitting cross-legged on the floor as her mother opened the old velvet box with hands that shook just a little. "This is yours now," her mother had whispered. "Your grandmother wore this when she left her village to start her new life. I wore it when I started mine. You'll wear it when you need to remember who you are." She hadn't needed to wear it often. Sometimes on special occasions, festivals, family gatherings where her own family felt so far away. She'd always been careful, gently wiping each piece with soft cloths, checking clasps, sliding them back into their pouches like she was returning treasures to a vault. She didn't need to flaunt them, just knowing they were there felt like her mother and grandmother standing behind her, a quiet shield against all the cold stares and tight smiles from in-laws who thought her people were beneath them. She picked up a second photo, her grandmother, so young she almost didn't recognize her. A black and white portrait, edges yellowed with time. Her grandmother's bangles glinted on her thin wrists, stacked so high they hid the faded scars from when she'd chopped wood every morning before the sun rose. She'd built her family's house with those hands, brick by brick, back bent in fields when there wasn't enough to eat. Those bangles were given to her by her own mother as a blessing, a circle of gold to remind her that no matter how rough life got, she was never poor in spirit. That spirit had been passed down to her mother. And then to her. She could hear her grandmother's voice in her mind, the old lessons about dignity and endurance. "Gold is not for showing off," she'd say, tapping her wrist with a thin finger. "It's for standing tall when others want to see you crawl." She thought about her mother-in-law's mocking tone, "You never wore them. They were collecting dust." As if these pieces were costume jewelry you tossed in a bag. As if they hadn't been bought coin by coin, each link forged with love and labor, kept close through war and loss and weddings and funerals. Her husband's silence echoed loudest of all. He'd watched it happen, had probably handed over the keys to that old safe himself, too spineless to tell his mother no. Maybe he'd forgotten what it meant, maybe he'd never cared. But she did. She gathered the photos, pressing them flat into an old folder, adding the receipts she'd saved all these years, the tiny pieces of proof that each item wasn't just hers by birthright but by name, by memory, by blood. She didn't care if they thought she was overreacting. She knew what that gold meant. It was her mother's voice, her grandmother's hands, her own promise to the little girl she'd once been. And if they thought she would let that go without a fight, they were about to see just how strong those women's blood ran in her veins. She woke up the next morning before the sun rose, the sky outside her bedroom window still a deep shade of ink. She lay there for a moment listening to her husband's steady breathing beside her, each exhale a reminder that the man she'd once trusted had stood by while his mother stole pieces of her life and handed them away like cheap souvenirs. She slipped out of bed without waking him. She didn't want another round of excuses, the same tired lines about keeping the peace or not making waves. He never did seem to mind when the waves crashed on her shore, so long as he got to stay dry. In the small office nook off the kitchen, she flicked on the desk lamp, its glow settling over the old file folders she'd stacked up the night before. The photos, the faded receipts, the insurance appraisal her mother had insisted on when she first married, everything she'd need if they dared to challenge her. She ran her finger along the edge of the oldest receipt, the ink nearly rubbed away from decades of handling. She found the name of the jeweler embossed at the top in fancy cursive, R. Joshi and Sons Fine Goldsmiths. She remembered sitting cross-legged on the hard wooden bench in that tiny shop as a little girl, the smell of polish and incense drifting through the air while her mother argued gently with the old man about clasp strength and weight. Her mother had trusted them. So would she. She pulled out her phone and dialed the number printed on the receipt. It rang 3 times before a calm, patient voice answered. Joshi and Sons. How can I help you? She cleared her throat, suddenly aware of how fast her heart was beating. I need to speak to someone about a family set. Purchased over 30 years ago. I have the receipts. I need to know if you can verify it's mine. The man paused, then spoke with the careful precision of someone who'd done this for decades. We keep records for every custom order. Do you have the item numbers? She rattled them off from the handwritten list, her voice steadying with each word. When she finished, there was a long silence. She heard him shuffle through papers or maybe pull up old digital records. Yes, he said finally. I see them here. They were custom-made for your mother. I remember, she brought her own gold coins for melting. Very proud pieces. He chuckled softly, the sound like a ghost of her mother in that shop all those years ago. She swallowed the lump rising in her throat. Can you confirm that for anyone who asks? Of course, he said. If you need written statements, notarized documents, anything, we can prepare it. Family sets like these, we always help protect. Do you need it for court? The word court settled over her like a cold breeze, final, hard, but fair. Yes, she said. Asterisk maybe. I'm not sure yet. But I'm going to do this properly. She ended the call and sat still for a moment, letting the quiet hum of the refrigerator fill the space. Then she picked up her phone again and scrolled through her contacts until she found the name she'd once hoped she'd never need, Nadia P., Family Law. A woman she'd met through a friend, who'd helped a coworker when her in-laws tried to snatch the house out from under her after a messy split. When Nadia answered, her voice was brisk but kind. She listened without interrupting while she explained the missing heirlooms, the mother-in-law's smug indifference, the sister-in-law parading around in her bangles like trophies. When she finished, her lawyer was quiet for a moment. You have proof? Nadia asked. Yes, she said. Asterisk receipts, photos, the jeweler's record. And my husband, he's useless. He won't back me up. Good, Nadia said, a hint of steel in her voice. Asterisk then we don't need him. I'll draft the letter this week. We'll make it clear this isn't a family squabble. This is theft. She hung up, the warmth of the lamp spilling over her hands, her tea gone cold but her pulse steady now. For so long, they'd counted on her to stay quiet, the sweet daughter-in-law who'd take every insult on the chin just to keep the family from tearing itself apart. Now they'd see how sharp that quiet could be. She didn't do it with shouting. She didn't slam doors or throw plates or make a scene in the middle of a family dinner like her mother-in-law probably expected her to. Instead, she did it in her living room, her space, not theirs, with the late afternoon sun pouring through the sheer curtains and her lawyer's letter tucked into a plain manila envelope on the coffee table. Her husband was there first, shifting from foot to foot, his eyes darting anywhere but her face. He hadn't argued much when she told him to bring his mother and sister to the apartment. He tried once, do we really have to make this so formal? But she just looked at him, so tired, so calm, that he shut his mouth. He still hadn't asked her how she'd felt when she found the empty drawer. He hadn't asked her what those pieces meant. Maybe he never would. When her mother-in-law arrived, she swept in like she owned the place. She barely gave the room a glance, nose wrinkled at the size of it, too small, too plain, no proper chandelier or polished floorboards. Her sister-in-law trailed behind, eyes downcast, bangles clinking on her wrist, her bangles. She wore them like trophies. They settled on the couch opposite her, a wide stretch of space between them that felt like a gulf. Her mother-in-law crossed her legs, her mouth pulled into that tight smile that always made her feel like a child asking for scraps. So, the older woman said, tone sugary enough to rot teeth. We're here. What is this about? I told you, those pieces look much better on Melissa. You should be flattered they're staying in the family. She didn't look at her husband. He was staring at the floor, his knuckles white. Useless. She slid the envelope across the coffee table. Her mother-in-law didn't touch it. So she opened it herself and laid out each piece, a copy of the jeweler's letter, signed and stamped. The insurance appraisal. The photos, her mother in her wedding sari, her grandmother in that old black and white, herself at 16 with the small hoops that used to dangle just above her shoulders. When she spoke, her voice was calm, almost gentle. These pieces were never yours to give. They were given to me by my mother, who got them from hers. They are in my name, they are in my insurance, and they are legally traceable. The jeweler remembers them, he has receipts. The lawyer knows what happened. I'm giving you one chance to return everything exactly as it was. Her mother-in-law scoffed. Don't be ridiculous. We're family. You wouldn't drag family into court over some old gold. She looked her straight in the eye. Try me. Her sister-in-law looked like she wanted to disappear into the cushions. She fiddled with the bangles on her wrist, eyes flicking from her mother to her brother to the floor. I didn't know, she mumbled, so low it was barely there. I thought you said they were yours to give. The older woman turned on her daughter, hissing through her teeth. Keep your mouth shut, Melissa. She's bluffing. She turned back, her tone sharp now. You think you're so smart? You think you can embarrass us, threaten us with lawyers? You'll regret this. She didn't flinch. She leaned forward instead, voice soft but heavy as iron. I won't regret it. Not for 1 second. If you don't return every piece, I will file theft charges. I will call the police, I will bring the receipts, I will stand up in court and make sure you explain to a judge why you stole a dead woman's wedding necklace and handed it to someone else. Do you really want that headline? Respected family matriarch steals heirlooms from her daughter-in-law. Her mother-in-law went pale, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Her husband just sat there, useless and silent, his eyes wide as if he'd just now realized the depth of what he'd let happen. She stood. I want them back by tomorrow. Every single piece. Or you'll deal with my lawyer instead of me. The older woman rose too, her anger sputtering out like a dying flame. This isn't how family works, she snapped. She held her gaze steady. No. This is how my family works. You don't get to rewrite that. And when they left, the mother-in-law glaring, the sister-in-law avoiding her eyes, she closed the door gently behind them. She turned the lock, leaned her forehead against the wood, and breathed in the quiet that felt like the first breath of freedom she'd taken in years. She didn't sleep much that night, but for once it wasn't because she was afraid. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the moonlight stretching pale fingers across the walls of her little apartment. Beside her, her husband pretended to sleep. She could hear the tightness in his breathing, the way he lay stiff as a board on his side of the bed. He hadn't said a word since they left, not an apology, not a protest. Maybe he thought it would all blow over in the morning. Maybe he still believed she'd bend like she always did, just to keep the family from crumbling. But she wasn't bending anymore. Some things were not hers to give away, not his to excuse, not his mother's to claim. That jewelry wasn't just gold and stones, it was sweat and sacrifice, a string of prayers whispered into metal and passed down from women who'd fought harder than she ever had. She could almost hear her mother's voice in the dark, stand your ground, Beatty. Some things can't be replaced once you let them go. In the morning, she brewed herself a cup of strong tea and waited. She didn't have to wait long. Before noon, a knock rattled the door, her mother-in-law's housekeeper, standing there awkwardly with a small padded bag clutched tight to her chest. No note, no apology, no signature, just the bag, handed over with downcast eyes. She thanked the girl softly, because it wasn't her fault. When she closed the door, she set the bag on the kitchen table like a sacred offering. She opened it slowly, half expecting to find something missing, a stone replaced with a cheap glass bead, a bangle bent out of shape. But there it was, the wedding necklace, the old bangles, the delicate earrings she'd gotten at 16. She lifted each piece gently from the pouch, running her fingers over the clasps, feeling the weight settle back into her palms. Her inheritance, hers alone. When her husband stumbled into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes, he stopped short at the sight of her there, each piece laid out on a folded tea towel like a blessing returned. He opened his mouth to speak, but she didn't let him. I'm putting these in my name only, she said, voice calm and clear. The jeweler will store them until I have a safe installed here, in my name. You won't touch them. Your mother won't breathe on them. Ever again. He bristled, the old reflex flickering in his eyes, the need to be the peacemaker, the one who smoothed things over when she dared make waves. But she didn't care anymore. She'd called the lawyer. She'd done the work. She didn't need his permission to protect what was hers. I just wanted to keep the peace, he muttered finally, his eyes drifting away. You blew this up. You could have just let it go. They're just things. She laughed then, soft but with a bitterness that made him flinch. No. They're not just things. They're my mother's hands. My grandmother's prayers. They're everything you never bothered to understand. When he left the kitchen, she didn't follow. She didn't beg him to stay and talk, didn't offer him the comfort he always expected her to hand over like an apology for being hurt. Instead, she sat there for a while, each piece of jewelry warm under her fingertips. She thought about her grandmother's bangles, how they'd clinked together when she worked in the fields, how she'd worn them as armor against a world that never made it easy for women like them. She thought about her mother's necklace, the way she'd lifted it to her throat the morning she got married, shoulders squared like a soldier going into battle. And she thought about herself now, a woman who'd finally stopped waiting for someone else to stand up for her. A woman who'd called the jeweler, called the lawyer, called back every scrap of dignity they'd tried to steal. She packed the jewelry away carefully and made a note in her phone, get the new safe installed next week. She'd keep it here this time, under her own lock and key. No one's fingers but hers would ever open it again. She poured herself another cup of tea and looked around her small kitchen. It wasn't fancy. It didn't have marble counters or a big family table where people gathered to gossip about how she should be grateful for whatever scraps they offered. But it was hers. And so was every piece of gold she'd fought to reclaim. She felt her mother's blessing in the quiet. And this time, she blessed herself, too.